Yeah, we need to get started. Tim was just coming over, so let's get started. Tim, go ahead.
Oh boy. The boss. Anyway. Yeah.
You could probably start anytime now. It's 10 after. This is one of those
Clickers.
clickers. Yeah, you don't need that.
Yeah, I don't need it.
I'll put it over here by
Are people starting to fill in on the?
the. They're putting the chairs up.
All right. I'll just wait
Got
until
the chairs up.
they come up.
Oh yeah. All right. They'll be up here momentarily.
Test. Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. So thankful for the faithful remnant here. And we honestly will have a very, very interesting day with very, very well-known entrepreneurs who've done tremendous things internationally. But as always, let us begin with a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, once again we come to you, thanking you for the privilege, the honor of being able to serve your eternal kingdom as much as we can in this world. With our expertise in business and entrepreneurship, our expertise in education and every form of good service. We ask you, Lord, to bless our endeavors this day, to bless our speakers, to bless to all those who will be listening, so that we might be collectively inspired and guided and protected as we leave this conference to do as much as we can to serve the common good in good profit through our various efforts and talents. We ask all of these things through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Just a couple of quick reminders. First, you should have some evaluation forms on your table by now. If you would not mind taking a couple of moments to fill those out whenever it's convenient. We really do use them, look at them, try to alter the conference to make it better on the basis of those evals. The second thing I just wanted to announce is that our panel this morning is sponsored by Dr. Attila and Anna Fresca, and Dr. Fresca will be one of our panelists as well. I think without further ado, I would like to introduce the panel today. As you know, it's going to be on international entrepreneurship and bringing good profit into the international arena through some business leaders who are very creative in these endeavors, and some of our speakers as well who are very creative in these endeavors. The panel moderator, who will also be introducing other panelists to you, is Iqbal Qadir. And if you did not hear him last year, one of the most remarkable international entrepreneurs I have ever met, or anyone else for that matter has ever met. This man he did his schooling in Bangladesh, came to Swarthmore University for his undergraduate studies, and then proceeded to the Wharton School for his graduate studies. Today he teaches at MIT and is trying to start a think tank in international entrepreneurship at MIT. He has done remarkable work by starting two major companies which have literally affected the lives of millions of people, really making the communications network in Bangladesh just meteoric increase in capacity through a very inexpensive cell phone service in two companies, Gonaphone and Grameenphone. And now he's working with his brother to take those inexpensive cell phones all over Bangladesh to use them for banking and for trading, so that there's a very cheap way of, inexpensive way of doing this. It's just making a huge difference. So without further ado, I ask Iqbal Qadir to introduce our other panelists to you, and of course, applause for Iqbal and what he's doing.
Thank you very much,
For some reason, said Iqbal, sorry.
Thank you so much. Why didn't you come in?
Yeah, good. Hey, God bless you guys. Bring your leg there.
Thank you. I think I am just going to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'll introduce at least by name and a little bit of introduction, and then each of you please spend 5 minutes, and then we go into question and answer. Yeah. So yesterday I was fortunate enough to be here and listen to Charles Koch and about good profits. And I think intuitively, I myself pursued some of those ideas. But I still try to make sense of it between my practice, what we have learned through thinkers like Adam Smith and Charles Koch. So I just will try to put it together, see if it makes sense to you. At least this is how it made sense to me. So I came to America 41 years ago from Bangladesh, and one of the things that I first noticed after coming to this country is that foundations, academic institutions, and similar bodies are called non-profits. But similar organizations in Bangladesh or other developing countries are usually called NGOs, non-governments. So it struck me, why are these things called non-profits in the United States while they are called NGOs in developing countries? Any thought? Why are they the same non-taxable entities, but they're called by two different names: non-profits, non-governments? Any thought on this? What? They both are non-taxable in both regions, but they're called a different name. The reason I think it reflects, in a global scale, a very deeply entrenched dichotomy. That is, the problem in developed countries are generally addressed through profits, and that is how they got developed. In those countries, when a profit-based approach do not work, for whatever reason, then people address it through non-profits. But the first attempt of solving or addressing any problem in a developing countries is assumed to be government. And if it doesn't work, try non-governments. So this apparent difference in names actually signifies something between the way we think about these two regions. One pursues profits, another tries to do things by governments. And that's what struck me. And frankly, this is, I believe, reflects some overall entrenched thinking, but also shows problems that the developing countries face. So during my college years, in the 1980s, I learned from Professor Russell Acuff, who is a professor of systems thinking and a philosopher at the Wharton School, that profits are the means to solve problems, not an end. And honestly, I use that in the projects that Father Spitzer mentioned. And so I want to make sense of what I learned from Charles Koch and see if it jives together. Charles Koch, by the way, Professor Russell Acuff died in 2009, and it turns out, as a coincidence, that as Cardinal Turkson was mentioning yesterday, that Pope Benedict XVI echoed this notion also in 2009. that profits should be seen as a means, not an end. This notion that profits are as the means, not an end, I think summarizes Charles Koch's what he practiced in his company, that businesses should profit by helping its customers profit or gain. And businesses should do this without being subsidized by customers or governments or by anybody. How does Koch's notion that good profits fit with the notion that profits are the means, not an end? This is how it made sense to me. The notion that profits are means, not an end, sorry to repeat this, but I want to go sequentially, is something that Adam Smith believed in as well. He certainly believed that the pursuit of profits, and he wrote that how business and commerce can proceed, but he didn't write a book on wealth of businessmen. He wrote a book on wealth of nations. So he also hated businesses making too much profits. He wanted those profits to erode away as fast as possible. Okay? Because, and how does that happen? If people are pursuing profits, how does the profit erode away? Smith recognized, of course, that this businessmen would see profits at their ends, but Smith wanted those profits to erode away, as I was saying. But through what? Through competition. Because profits, if you make too much profits, that alone it would attract imitators, and then your profits, if the imitators become competitors, and that's how your profits would go away. And thus, the process as a whole advances the society. Now, therefore, too much profits is actually self-correcting. No matter how, even if bad profits would be self-correcting. And what I like about this is that the bad profits, if according to Charles Koch, maybe you start with bad profits, but it would correct itself and eventually turn into good profits. Because we need to find that. Because even though self-interest does not rule everything, and I'm sure there's a lot of wonderful Catholic teaching teaches us how to take care of other people, and I myself kind of pursued it. But what is the ultimate fallback position? We really need to go, that's why I think it's important to look into the self-interest issues, because that would, if not everybody is well behaving, and therefore how do we actually arrive at something systematic that we could count on? So anyway, this is I think Charles Koch went a step further. He has been very wise to attempt to preempt competition and accept the challenges that competition would bring about and thereby stay ahead of competition. He foresees that competition would do to what the competition would do to him and already addresses them and thereby stays ahead of the game. That makes good amount of profits, but also he allows the society to benefit from what competition would have brought about, but he avoids that by preempting competition, by being ahead of it. Now, competition does wonderful things, and I want to tell you a little bit about my own experience. I won't take very much time. I organized a mobile phone company that I did, and I myself witnessed a host of benefits that came out of not necessarily in the Charles Kochian way of good profits, but it's simply search for profits and self-interest generated. I'll list a dozen things right now, okay, that came about through what I witnessed myself. Number one, and of course I'm talking about this over and above that it gave a lot of empowerment to citizens through better communications and thereby greater accountability. So I'll list a dozen of them very rapidly. Number one, it empowered consumers through choices, because profits led to competitors, and therefore, in addition to having communication facilities, they had choices. Number two, more innovations. Because we had competition, we had to innovate more rapidly, okay, to protect our own self-interest and search for profits. We had to innovate. Number three, because we were making profits, like the Kochian way, that we were gaining by helping others gain. We were making profits, so therefore we could keep on expanding. Right now, this company serves 60 million people, okay. Number four, it forced us to reduce prices because there are competition. Who has showed up? Because we were trying to make profits. Now, it also increased, we were forced to increase wages of employees because otherwise they were being poached by the competitors, okay? So we were forced to give our employees better salaries. Number 6, owners were forced to provide training because we have bought millions of dollars worth of equipment. If we don't train our employees, we are not going to make much profits. So we are forced to train them, give them education, okay? And 7, they were also learning from working. So they got education from 2 sources. One is we were training, spending more millions of dollars to train them, but also they were learning by actually working there. Number 4, we couldn't discriminate. I couldn't hire a Hindu or a Christian or a Muslim because I like one or the other, but simply because whoever is good, I had to hire him in order to produce profits, okay? So under the profit pressure, I became non-discriminatory and promoting meritocracy. And then I put ads in the paper because there's competition, and as a result, I supported a transparency in the country because media was getting revenues through our advertisement. And of course, competition dispersed power, which also create greater accountability. Number 11, it removed corruption, at least in one front. Because when you have a monopoly state-owned enterprise, if people have too much power. If you want a telephone, somebody would extort and say, you have to give me this, that, too. But now there are 5 or 6 companies. Nobody could extort, because then if I try to extort somebody, then my customer would go to somebody else. And of course, it gave rise to increased intellect relationship between governments, business, and citizens. So here is a dozen benefits that did not necessarily come from good profits, but just plain profits. But that gave rise to greater accountability, and I think it ultimately would force us to become more chasing good profits, as Koch defined. So the key is competition that comes from search for profits. And therefore, profits are a means of progress, period. Okay? Now, I think this is all said and good. However, the world does not quite unfold in the way Adam Smith or Russell Acuff or Charles Koch wish it did. Why? There are many problems, and that do not work. So I'll just list 3 things and get out of the way. One is depth. Consumers often do not have the depth of the supplier. Namely, the buyer knows a lot less than the seller. We cannot assume that they have the time to figure out everything. They're busy with kids, with their healthcare needs, their schooling, they're making 2 ends meet. They do not have the time, whereas the seller is spending full time on whatever he's producing. Okay, so the seller always have an advantage. And so therefore, the consumers can confirm what they value. This is generally true, but not always true. I mean, I read Koch's book, and it says that they prefer fossil fuel over solar panels. This is on page 9. That's not quite true. They prefer it because it's cheaper, the fossil fuels, okay? But so this is not true that just because they are not buying solar panels that they necessarily prefer that. And it's more complicated than that. Then I'll tell you another point, that in general, and governments can try to do regulations, and regulations don't work, but thus the world gets more complicated. But to assume that the consumers know the best is not quite true, at least not always true. The second thing is deception, that we do not always say what we mean and mean what we say, okay? Deception has been around for a long time, okay? It's been since the Trojan horse, you know. We had actually admired that he tricked somebody, okay? So the tricking is going on all the time, okay? And in fact, fake news is not new. It's been around, okay? And so what I'm saying is we buy, for instance, low-fat food is actually high-sugar food. Or orange juice you could buy, which we think is a good thing, but it has a lot of sugar in it, okay, which is not a good thing, okay. So, I'm going beyond the products that Cardinal Turkson mentioned yesterday, kind of like human trafficking or drugs. I'm talking about things that are claimed to be good, but are not necessarily good. That is a problem all over the economy, okay. And finally, the dichotomy. The United States or other countries have become economically powerful through good profits and profit purpose. That's why I said non-profits and non-government. How did it come about? But what I'm saying is we made progress through profits, but promoted statism in other countries. Generally speaking, through development aid or colonialism in the past, in general, there's a massive amount of hindrance to search for profits in developing countries, because profit purposes are not quite appreciated. That's why I was mentioning initially that there are these non-governments as opposed to non-profits. So, in fact, yesterday in the Wall Street Journal article I saw about Coke, it says if you agree that profits are that if you don't pursue profits, it's not automatically gives rise to cooperation. It gives rise to collusion, and collusions against the have-nots, usually for the haves. This is written in the Wall Street Journal article that passed around. So if we agree that profits are a means of progress, and if we also agree that we have promoted statism in poor countries, then we need to ask ourselves a question. Have we deprived them of a means of progress, which is profits? Thank you very much. I will now introduce each of you with perhaps one at a time. Okay. So we'll go from this side. Yes? Okay. So I'll now first go with Okendo Lewis-Gale, and he's the founder and chairman of Harambee Entrepreneurs Alliance. He's also an advisor to Mark Zuckerberg, the famous IT entrepreneur, and his work in Africa. So please go.
Oh, well, thank you so much, and thank you all for having me this morning. Again, my name is Okendo Lewis-Gale, and incidentally, last month I was with Cardinal Turkson at the Vatican, and we both realized that we were going to be here. And when I saw the list of very accomplished people, and then I saw my name, I thought for sure that there'd been a mistake. And so I told the Cardinal, well, there must be a mistake, and without blinking, the Cardinal looks at me and says, well, infallibility does not apply to all institutions of the church. So whether this was a mistake or a conscientious sin, I'm glad to be here. And particularly because I'm actually a proud Harvard man, and so it's good to be at the business school here. So thank you all. As Iqbal mentioned, I am the founder. I guess my contribution to this discussion comes from my experience over the last decade. I am the founder of a network of young African entrepreneurs, and as Iqbal mentioned, Mark Zuckerberg led a $24 million investment into one of our companies in Nigeria, and as a result, I'm now the Africa advisor for him and his wife at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative in the sunny Republic of Palo Alto, where the sun always seems to shine. And at the risk of sounding simplistic, as we think about the correlation between profit and good, it's abundantly clear to me that that correlation is both manifest and pretty straightforward in many of with the entrepreneurs that we're dealing with across Africa. The more successful our companies, the more our employees can develop professionally, support their families, and contribute to the welfare of their societies, period. Now, I am conscious that that is not gospel truth. Not all profit is good, and not all good derives or flows from the fountain of profit. But it is certainly the case that as you look at some of the work that young African entrepreneurs are doing to better their societies, that correlation is very strong. The company that Mark invested in is called Andela. And what Andela does is, Andela simply believes that talent is equally distributed. Talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And so they simply have built a company to help to try to change that. And so they trained, they identify unskilled young Nigerians, Ugandans, and Kenyans. They train them to become some of the world's best software developers, and then they incorporate them into companies around the world, whether it's Microsoft, Udacity. And if you want to know the strong correlation between these two, all you have to do is look into the eyes of fellows at Andela, farmers who are working in the Moringa Connect network, or students at Spark schools. And you really begin to see how there is a very strong correlation, and one that we must continue to advocate for, partly because at its best, this could be done at scale and change and transform the lives of not just a few communities, but millions of people. And so that really is my contribution to the cause here. And I guess I'll shut up now before you rescind my invitation.
Okay. So I'll go next. Is Andrej Sokuva. He formed an alliance of internet company in Slovakia, and now he works for Google.
Thank you, John.
Please tell more. Yes.
I would like to start with a disclaimer and one correction. Disclaimer is that everything I say is my personal opinion. It doesn't reflect, it's not a formal position of my employer, Google. And one correction, when you read the bio, my bio in the document, in the brochure, it says 2 children, happily married with 2 children. So it's not true. We have a 2-month-old little baby, little Andre at home. So I wanted to correct that printing error. So I would like to share with you 3 perspectives. The first one is why I think that many of the businesses of the digital companies are actually in line with good profits internationally. Secondly, I will try to pose a question, what are the tough societal discussions and what is the role of technology companies in those discussions? And last, I would like to share with you a couple of practical things I observe digital companies do to remain long-term, try to aim to remain long-term competitive. So in the first point, yesterday we heard about creating value. And so I think that digital companies are showing that if you create an excellent product or service and you are able to scale this to a global audience, you are rewarded by profit. So there is an aspect of the scale, aspect of being innovative in the business models, and as a result, the reward is profit. Now, I would argue as a digital optimist, I would argue that a lot of the business of the digital companies is in line with the Catholic social teaching. Look at the principle of solidarity. So indifferently whether your phone is 60 euro or a very expensive phone, you get the same access to the same information. There is a component of solidarity. There is a component of subsidiarity where people from the least developed communities actually have now channels of communication through which they can channel their opinions. A beautiful example of subsidiarity. I think I would even argue about dignity of human beings. If you look, and I can share my personal experience, the development of the talent in these companies is extraordinary. And contributing to common good, creating networks, facilitating the discussion, and oftentimes releasing these tools, at least in case of Google, for free. Yesterday we heard that one characteristic of a long-term successful companies is a not focus on profit, but focus on a big vision. And I think this is what truly matters. If you look at Google, organized world information. If you look at Amazon, everything store. If you look at PayPal, just allow instant, secure global transactions to anybody. So really, I think that additional aspect is that there is a big mission and big vision, not necessarily the focus on excessive profits. I would also argue that we are in the beginning of an exponential growth of great opportunities. We have seen the rise of internet. We have seen the rise of digital devices. Think like this is basically a supercomputer. And I think that we are now experiencing first time a usefulness of algorithms which are related to artificial intelligence. And all of that, I would argue, makes us these times the best times in the history to be an entrepreneur. Why? First of all, because the amount of value that is created for customers is, I think, extraordinary. And secondly, I think that indifferently of your social and economic and geographical status, the price of devices, the price of connectivity, the amount of data available, and a lot of the AI capabilities available through cloud make it a unique moment for anybody to start a business and make it a global, reach out to global customers. Now, the second point I wanted to mention is that we should be truthful, and there are big societal questions and debates to be held. There is a dramatic transformation happening at the intersection of technology, society, companies, and I think that some of those those questions, societal questions, require a lot of very focused discussion. Some examples is the future of work. Are we doomed to be, without work? Fake news, hate speech. I would even mention trust, just the trust in basic institutions, trust in the society, trust of people in the society, trust of people in the technology. Now, what is the role of the companies? I think that companies are trying to be long-term sustainable and profitable, of course, by constantly innovating. And in a certain sense, I think that what digital companies can bring to the table is a richness of understanding technical details. But I would argue that a lot of these questions are more a societal question rather than a technological question. So I would be a little bit careful to give a trust or give hope that technological companies and engineers would say something which are actually a societal discussion to be held. And the positive message I want to share with you and also with Catholic University of America is that in a very strange way, I think we are experiencing a resurrection of a Catholic principle, which is faith and reason. So we look at the faith and we care in our business about the communities around us, about those which are less disadvantaged. And then we have to form recommendations which are rational, which are reasonable, which there is a reason. And I think digital companies, the whole digital world is about facts, about numbers, about assessment, about data. And so in a certain sense, this digital world can find some inspiration or revitalization of this fact and reason that we bring as Catholics to the debate. I don't think there is a one silver bullet for all the challenges that we are experiencing. I think that governments will more and more not be able to cope with these issues, and as a result, they may have a more convening role, but the discussions should include companies, societal stakeholders, civil society, and this is my call for action, actually, here. I think that we Catholics have a richness of Catholic social teaching that is immense, that is great. And on the other hand, we have societies and companies which are desperately looking for some kind of a framework, how to shape their development of the new products and services. And I think it could be an amazing match where really a Catholic doctrine can help frame the debate and find answers to these really difficult societal questions that we are experiencing, and that, by the way, companies and engineers will very easily implement. So the challenge, and this is my last point, is the challenge is actually if we as a society can agree this is black and this is white, once that is agreed, engineering solution comes very, very quickly. But to get to that point, especially in these wider societal issues, it's more complicated. So I believe in what I would call a human-centered digital transformation. So human person, human dignity should be always in the center. And in a certain sense, digital companies, relentlessly focus on searching for what customers want and get their feedback and incorporate it. So in a certain sense, the human is in the center. And I think that the last point I wanted to make is that what do digital companies, I think, do good, or how do they invest these days to remain long-term competitive, creating value? And my approach, what I observe, for example, within Google is there are three big principles. One is ask big questions, think big time. So think about big questions, not just micro questions. Seek technology breakthrough and be prototype driven. And this is something what we heard yesterday. So give it a try, fail quickly if you have to fail, learn and move on. So this adaptability is very, very important. And then know the user, build products that are accessible to people all over the world. So in a summary, I think, and that was an interesting idea we heard also yesterday, good profit requires good people. And I think that the one way to go forward is what I would call a relentless investment into human capital and talent development. It starts, in my company, it starts from the hiring to the crucial role of middle managers who actually form the teams, are in touch with many of the employees, are able to relocate or help them in the transformation, trust, building the teams, trust among the team members, safety, ability to think freely and innovate, and then, of course, endless opportunities for training and education and skills. So I think we are all called by God for greatness. So it's a good news that we are called to be relentlessly working on new opportunities. And I will close my intervention by MIT professor Eric Brillion's quote, "Technology is not destiny. We human beings shape our destiny." I'm a profound believer in this. I think that we have a moral, as one of my colleagues says, we have a moral obligation to be optimists about our future, to seek at the future as an opportunity and find new creative entrepreneurial ideas how to bring value to the users, to customers, and also to the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. So we now move to Dr. Attila Fresca, who is the Chief Operating Officer of CUA, and he's from originally from an immigrant family from Hungary, but I'll let him tell for himself. But and he can show how technology is being used as a destiny or a journey.
Good morning, everybody.
There we go. You can see I'm technologically handicapped here as well. I don't know which button to push. So as Iqbal mentioned, my name is Attila Fresca. I have to make a disclaimer similar to what my colleague here mentioned. Anything that I say does represent my company's views as well as my own personal views. It's a benefit of being a partner in the company, I guess. Although, perhaps I wish I were a partner in Google, I don't know. Ours is ever so slightly smaller. I am also a pinch hitter here, so you will not see my bio, and Iqbal asked me to make a couple of quick comments about just my personal background. As he mentioned, I'm from a Hungarian immigrant family. I spent a good part of my childhood in the US here, as well as back in Europe. Spent the late 80s working in the Silicon Valley, then with the 90s spent bulk of my time back in Central and Eastern Europe, working back in Europe as the markets changed. Then came back in the late 90s to the Silicon Valley, just in time for the dot-com bust. And perfect timing, I guess. and then came here to the East Coast and got in private equity for the past 12 years or so, spending the bulk of that time in Asia. The point being that I've lived in Europe, here in the United States professionally, as well as in Asia, and given the international spirit of this panel this morning, wanted to make some comments along those lines in terms of what I've observed. Iqbal did also ask me to just talk a little bit about Secureport briefly to give you a perspective of where my more recent comments were coming from. Secureport is an information technology integrator, an IT integrator that provides security solutions to foreign governments. We do not do any business here in the United States, well, on a very limited basis. However, we do provide border security solutions to foreign governments, specifically tools with which those governments can vet who's coming into the country and who's coming out. And to use a word that used to be taboo here within the Beltway in Washington, D.C., to profile people. Are they potentially human trafficker? Are they potentially a radicalized jihadist? Are they potentially a narcotics trafficker? And so on and so forth. The point here really that should be the takeaway from what I am doing currently for the past 5 years is that I am involved in B2G business activity, business to government. I'll get back to that in a moment, so please keep that in mind as I look at a couple of foundation thoughts here to build up to this quagmire, I'll call it, related to B2G business. Listening to the comments over the past few days, starting with, of course, even Dina Dwyer's talk on Wednesday night, I was really struck by the question of how do you measure good profit? And some of the common things that I saw, some of the common elements were looking at the employee relationship piece. How are employees being treated? As we've heard from some of the other speakers, are we looking at things from a CST, from a Catholic social teaching perspective as we're managing our employees? Are we looking at it from the perspective of subsidiarity? And what about our vendors? How are we interacting with those vendors? Are we treating them in a proper manner, in a professional manner, in a good profit manner? And we can go on and on looking at these different areas where we can then define metrics, customer satisfaction being another common one. And all of this is very easy to monitor within what I'll call, with no offense to anybody involved only in domestic business, but within the bubble, let's say, of North America, the United States and Canada. We have a relatively stable environment here, a marketplace of, close to 400 million people if we include Canada. And we have a very stable, predictable regulatory environment. So as we engage in business, things such as Iqbal mentioned in his introductory comments, such as corruption. Yes, of course there is corruption here in North America, but is it as rampant as what we see in other countries in Africa or Southeast Asia or in Latin America? I can tell you from personal experience, it's day and night. It's day and night. So as we start to now extend our business activities into the global forum and engage in business activities outside of the protected bubble, this safe zone, I'll call it, that we have here, that we're blessed with, how do things change? And how do those metrics with which we can measure whether or not we as business leaders are engaged in generating a good profit, do they still apply? Do those metrics still apply? And let's compound the scenario. Compound the scenario with the added dimension of not being engaged in B2B, so business-to-business type of business activity, selling to foreign businesses, let's say, or to foreign consumers with perhaps cell phone services or with other types of social media services, but selling to those governments, and selling to those governments in developing countries where we all know in this room, and anybody on the street will know, corruption is rampant. When we start to move to that added dimension, do the measurement metrics still apply? Now, in an interesting conversation with Iqbal, He said, well, what do you do in cases like that? You go to Minister X and you're offering the state-of-the-art security solution to help them combat terrorist activity. Or you even go to the cabinet level, and at some point there is a request made. In the Middle East, of course, they call it bakshish. In Latin America, mordida, schmiergeld, right? But the request is made. Now, the answer to Iqbal's question, what do you do in a case like that? Certainly from a U.S. legal perspective, I say we are a U.S. company, we are bound by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and the answer is no, and we lose, quite frankly, a lot of business, whereas our foreign competitors then step in and play by the local rules and get the business. It's a reality that we have to ask ourselves, or we have to face. But then we have to ask ourselves the follow-on question, or at least I asked myself, and this came up in my discussion with Iqbal. Is it a legal question, or is it a moral question? And if we were to engage in that, if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of our I almost said corrupt competitors, our foreign competitors, little Freudian slip perhaps, if we put ourselves in the shoes of our foreign competitors, and we ask ourselves then the same question, as we fulfill this contract that was secured, it was acquired through bribes. If I were in the shoes of that foreign competitor, and I won't mention nationalities, but we can all imagine which nationalities are more inclined to play by local rules, would the profit from that contract be a good profit? It really becomes a moral question now. Now, juxtapose that from, many of you know I used to teach in the MSBA program here at Catholic University. And I can think very clearly about some very spirited discussions about corruption in the classroom. And a number of students from, I'll mention the country, Nigeria, were arguing and advocating that, yes, if that official accepts a bribe, it's common practice, and it's a way for them to be able to better support their family because they're underpaid. Very spirited discussions, but it brings to light a different perspective, a different cultural perspective. And as we look at the value question, what is right and what is wrong, we have to ask ourselves. So if I were to ask that foreign competitor, are you generating a good profit? Many of them would answer, just as my Nigerian student did, saying, I'm helping that foreign official's family by supplementing their otherwise subsistence income. So let's circle back now to this question I started out with, which is, can we use those metrics to evaluate our business activities in the foreign field, in the foreign markets, and determine whether or not we are generating a good profit? Well, in certain aspects, certainly yes. Certainly yes. If we're talking about how we're dealing with our customers, how we're dealing with our employees, especially the employees that we have hired locally. And we at Securaport employ 50 to 100 employees in any given country that we operate in. And we have 18 contracts around the world right now. So we have quite a few foreign employees. And I can say that we are treating them quite well. If I look at the customer satisfaction perspective, well, we haven't lost contracts, so that's a good sign. Perhaps an indicator of customer satisfaction. But moving on to how we're dealing with vendors and so on and so forth, there are these metrics that certainly apply. But we have a cultural dimension that perhaps puts everything in a different light as we look at whether or not a contract that is perhaps inappropriately secured is evaluated. And I don't know the answer to that question, and I'll leave you with no ending to this movie. I'll let everybody answer that question because that's how I answer the classroom discussion as well. Everybody at the end of the day, just as we're making moral decisions based on whatever type of preparation we have, our moral compass, have to decide for ourselves. But I would argue that there is a different dimension as we start to look at different cultural norms, what is accepted and what is not, in many countries around the world. With that, I'll stop because I know Iqbal is giving me the dirty look. So, thank you.
Thank you, Attila. So I think we should open it up because there isn't very much time left for questions that our panelists can answer. There's one question has come on the computer. I'll just read that. One is for all panelists. How do you think that the internet has affected ethics in business? So, how do you think that the internet has affected ethical behavior? How did the internet increase or decrease ethical behavior in business? Who wants to go for that?
We're looking at you.
I'm happy.
Yeah, okay.
I have an easy and difficult answer or opinion. It's not an answer. On one hand, the question to me seems a little bit similar to as we would ask, how did electricity influence the ethics? So the internet is a tool that allows good things and bad things to happen, and we are equally responsible to make sure that it's not a valueless space.
Yes.
But that's the easy answer. The more complicated answer is that would be a sociological question: how are people acting in the condition of anonymity? I think that's the question. And then I think it's less about the internet, but more about what are the values of the people if they know they are not observed, or they pretend, they think they are anonymous. And I think then we see a lot of, complicated things happening. And but I would argue that it's probably more the fact that we believe we are anonymous and nobody knows who we are, and that somehow triggers the kind of our internal whatever bad intentions or actions.
But electricity does, if we bring that analogy back, electricity does affect our behavior. I mean, if the street lights are not on, there will be more crime on the streets at night. So if electricity is around and the streets are lit up, I expect less crime. So similarly, what did the internet do?
If I may,
Yeah.
perhaps being tolerant with the example of one of our entrepreneurs. He's a gentleman who started a company called EWTN. And what they do is they try to bring transparency into the finances of the government of Nigeria. They ought to make him a saint, really. And what they do, it's funded by Bill Gates, Soros. It's gotten quite a lot of attention. And what they do is they publish. If the government says, well, we allocated $10 million to a school in northern Nigeria, then they will actually make that available. They actually use a lot of mobile phones to ensure that people know, hey, the government did it. Is that happening or not? And that brings actually greater transparency into it. So certainly that's one example of how it could be used to increase accountability and certainly awareness. Now, of course, we're humans, and so I'm sure we could mess it up too, but a good thing could be done with it.
Okay. There's a new question for Andres. It says, do you agree that there are varied perceptions of corruption? What percentage of bribery are initiated by corporations versus developing nations' governments? I'm just reading the question.
I have no clue. I think that transparency is the answer to this question. More transparency. Bringing one advantage of internet is that actually you can track down, you can find out the data, and I think that more transparency is the answer. And another part of my answer would be community engagement. I think that if there is a transparency and if there is a technological tools that allow people to participate, all of us are are called to participate and bring together communities and be part of the discussion. But whenever it comes, I think what our colleague said about different cultural regimes and different stages of the development of a society, I think the anonymity, the instability of the government rules or clear rules is probably, we can expect that it's increasing the chances of incorrect behavior. Yeah. So I think from a business perspective, business appreciates transparency in the rules. We know and we try to abide by the rules. I think that's the best. Then you can calculate that into your business. But I will conclude by what I said. I don't have enough data to answer that question.
Okay. I have a question for Attila. Your Nigerian students, will they consider U.S. corporate entertainment, campaign finance, tips, or corruption?
Well, let's start with the new practice at Uber of tipping. Certainly not in the area of tipping, unless you're talking about tipping to government officials, which I think they would classify, certainly. If you're talking about some type of a kickback. It also goes to, let's just say, the business-to-business dimension as well. What happens when your purchasing manager is getting a kickback from one of your vendors? And that vendor, even though there are competitive bids, is always getting the contract, right? I think in all those counts, whether we're talking about my former Nigerian students or any students for that matter, would agree that those are all inappropriate and unethical business practices. When you get to campaign finance, you certainly are getting into the gray area. And this is comparable to something that you actually mentioned during our chat previously, and that is, well, how corrupt is it for a foreign citizen to basically buy their visa through the business visa program here in the United States? Is that a level of corruption? And again, some people might argue yes, some people might say, well, no, it's actually prescribed as legal. It's prescribed as legal and therefore it's not. And that's where the definition of what is legal and what is not becomes black and white, because it is in fact law. One is legal, one is not, right? And so that might be one of the criteria we can apply as well. Certainly, just because it's legal, I'll throw out there, just because it's legal does not mean that it's moral. And we have that dilemma that is an ongoing issue, again, that has to be evaluated by each individual as they are confronted with these sometimes very vexing situations.
Okay, there's another question now. It's open to all panelists. What role does trust play in profitable businesses? And is trust understood differently in different cultures?
I actually have an interesting story. I moved to China to learn Chinese years ago. And the Chinese have a saying which says, "You guanqi, mei guanqi," which is if you have a relationship, no problems. And it's fascinating because they tend not to. I think part of what happens in this country is we've come to trust the legal system to the point that it kind of doesn't matter whether you, I trust you or not, as long as you sign that piece of paper, I can take you to court. But in systems where those judiciary is not as strong, trust is indispensable. And I suspect that you're seeing that certainly across the continent, where our entrepreneurs, the most important asset they have is the trust that their investors and their community places in them. And without that, it's very difficult to operate. So it is certainly a sine qua non condition for many of our entrepreneurs.
But perhaps I will, okay, please go.
Just one sentence. I think in a digital business and digital industry, trust is the key currency, if we could say that. And I think that is also reflected in the fierce competition. So if you have a more traditional factories or goods, the moment you lose trust because your car is producing different amount of CO2 emissions, as you were told, you are not going to change the car immediately. So there is some kind of a resistance, even though your trust is broken. I think in the digital world, this doesn't happen. I think that trust, the moment it is broken, the consequences to business are almost immediate. Look at search engines such as Alta Vista or Yahoo. For whatever reasons, once the customers lose the trust, it takes half a second and I go somewhere else.
I do think there is no question, so I will take this question and try to say something I believe in. We often use trust or any cultural matter to explain things that are different in different cultures. This is usual habit we have. But I do think culture is not fixed. It's actually a little bit of a cop-out of trying to explain what is going on in a given society. The technology, institutions, many things are impacting on the culture. If a technology change, culture change. In this country, which is a very matured economy, there is a great deal of change because the internet came in, the Twitter came in, anything else, cell phone, these are all changing the culture in this country. And I think you can see the politics of this country to clearly show the impact of technology on our culture. And same thing is true in other countries. They have been more static, and therefore they don't seem to change because of various prevention, including the statism I was talking about. But also, they're also changing. So I think it's really not necessarily very productive to say, oh, cultures, that's what explains their behavior. Because in the end, that's not a button you can press and change it. What can you press? I think introduction of technologies or other kinds of influences are actually forces of change. Thank you. So I think time is pretty much up. So, and there is no more questions. I think we have satisfied the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yes, Attila, I'm Slovak.
I'll move the computer.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I just want to, once again,
Microphone here. I need some cultural change.
Did you hear that? I need some cultural change. I love it. I want to thank once again Iqbal and Attila and Okendo and Andres for a really stimulating set of thoughts, which gets back to, of course, good profit. I love the way that Iqbal began the discussion by talking about those 9 huge advantages of profit, that namely profit will always tend toward the good for education, good for technology, good for efficiencies, good for production, and the 9 goods that he mentioned always tend toward goods for culture, for economy, for society. But then he pointed out, and all of our panelists pointed out, we just have to be vigilant all the time about trying to make sure that the enemies of good profit, the enemies of competition, don't start rearing their ugly heads. Collusion, corruption, deceit, cronyism, all the things that we've heard about in the last 2 days, or now 3 days, that are now becoming apparent as things that take the good propensity of profit, at least as Adam Smith and others intended it, and sort of undermine it and make it tend in the long run toward a statism or some other kind of corruption that will interfere with the good that profit can do. But I think at the end, what all of our panelists said was really interesting, that there's sort of a transcendence of, competition and the profit motive itself. That it tends to almost, in a way, it has a way of purifying its advocates, the people who are playing in the marketplace. Because at the end of the day, colluders are going to be inefficient in world markets. I mean, I certainly picked that up. Colluders and deceivers are going to be, in the end, undermining the trust within their organizations and outside their organizations, which means that in the end, they're going to have a competitive disadvantage in world markets, so that as we sort of are in a more globalized environment that all of our panelists were talking about, and we are going to have to compete more and more in world markets, all of these, sort of underminers of capitalism, or at least underminers of good profit within capitalism, tend to shoot themselves in the foot. And as they do, it's almost like the Darwin Award. They eliminate themselves from the marketplace, or in the Darwin Award, from the genetic package. So I want to thank our panelists once again for, these are really excellent insights and things I just haven't really thought about completely, but it just was a real eye-opener for me, and thank you very, very much for that enlightening panel. By the way, I didn't mean to ignore honesty as a principle either. So, what I do want to do now is introduce to you, I think, one of the most innovative educational world entrepreneurs, James Tooley. I think you will see in James Tooley a man who is, by himself almost, transforming many cultures throughout the world, and really the world itself, by bringing education, specifically private education, to a whole new kind of global accessibility that we haven't seen before. He wrote a book called The Beautiful Tree, a book which espouses a model which he and many others have implemented throughout the world that is literally leading millions of people to educational access they never had before. In fact, the book was so influential it won the Sir Anthony Fisher Prize in Great Britain and several other prizes internationally. Additionally, James puts his, as it were, his work and his money where his words are, his mouth is. And he has started 3 significant educational institutions to bring that private education in developing countries. He's got the Cadmus Academies in Honduras. He also started the Omega Schools in Ghana. And he's also started the Cadmus education in India. And this is just, kind of the tip of the iceberg. He's also a patron of the a foundation called Formidable Education, which has united 5,000 schools involving 1 million students in Nigeria, right? This is one of the most populous countries in the world. This is really a super innovator, a really interesting guy who also happens to be a professor there at University of Newcastle, and he's a research fellow for the Independent Institute here, and so in the United States. And so it's with a really great honor and pleasure that I welcome James Tooley to our podium.
Thank you very much, Father. I hardly recognize myself from that warm introduction.
So humble, I assure you.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I've been doing a lot of traveling lately, and on one of my flights, we waited at the gate for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, before finally we were airborne. And when we were flying, I asked the air hostess what the problem had been, and she said, "Oh, no problem. The pilot was bothered by some noises from the engine. And it took us a while to find a new pilot." And the moral of this story, ladies and gentlemen, the moral of this story is too often in education, we tinker, we find a new pilot, when instead we should be looking at the system. We should be looking at the engine. And what I want to talk to you, the slides are so far away, can you see them? Anyway, I've got lots of visuals, I hope you can see them. Malala, you all know Malala, don't you? She was the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The story you all know as well. She was on her way to school when she was shot by the Taliban. But there's something missing in the account of her that is odd to me. You've probably filled in the details when you hear the international agencies, the BBC and others describing her story, and you filled in the details. She was on her way to public school, and her father, the headmaster of the public school, and she was shot. That's not true at all. She was on her way to the school that her father had created. He was an educational entrepreneur. He had created a low-cost private school, and she was on her way to private school. And this is a phenomenon that is all over the world. I discovered it for myself 17 years ago. I was in Hyderabad, and I was on a consultancy from the International Finance Corporation. I'd become an expert on private education. And we all know, don't we, that private education is about the rich. Private education is about the elite. My mission in life, for reasons that this conference will understand, I think, was to serve the poor. And here I was, an expert on private education, which is about the rich. So how do you bring those two things together? I went into the slums of the old city of Hyderabad, and the parts of my life were brought together. I found a low-cost private school. In those days, charging about $1, $2 per month. And then I found another and another. And soon I was in access with a federation of 500 of these low-cost private schools. I spoke to parents, mostly Muslim mothers in this part of Hyderabad. And I said, well, why do you send your children to private school when the government school is free and you get free books and free lunch to boot? And mother after mother told me the same story. In the public schools, the government schools, our children are abandoned. And I went to see one of these public schools. I went with the district education officer. They knew we were coming. And he was incredibly candid. We arrived there, and there were 130 kids in a class on the floor, sitting there amongst the mosquitoes. These bright, bushy-eyed kids wanting to learn, really keen to see this visitor, but doing nothing. Day after day doing nothing, because the teachers in the government schools had abandoned them. There were only 2 teachers present that day, and as Malala relates in her book about government schools in Pakistan, there were only 2 teachers in that sort of school every day. The other teachers had a rota. They even had a rota to say when they could come and when they could leave their children abandoned. I came back to Washington, D.C., to the World Bank IFC headquarters here. I thought there was something quite incredible going on here in poor areas, these low-cost private schools. I came back and wanted to tell people about this, and all they said was, calm down, Tooley, calm down. You've seen maybe a couple of businessmen ripping off the poor. I thought, ripping off the poor? They're staying weekends and doing science fairs and sports fairs for these kids. They're doing extra work. But no, the idea was dismissed. So I thought there was something going on here. So I managed to get funding from the John Templeton Foundation. And I went out to see if this phenomenon existed elsewhere. And we went to places like Makoko in Lagos. So visitors to Nigeria, to Lagos, when you get off at the airport, you go to Victoria Island, probably. That's where the posh hotels are. And you go across Third Main Bridge, and you might see down there in the water, Makoko, this shanty town built on stilts into these dark waters of the Lagos Lagoon. And I was passing that way myself on the way to Victoria Island on my first visit, and I said, that's where I want to go. That's where I want to find low-cost private schools. And my host said, it's too dangerous. You can't go there. So the next day I went without him, and we drove in the taxi and took me to the edge of the shanty town. The taxi took me there, and he said, I can't go beyond here. It's too dangerous. So I went in a canoe and went around there and soon found some children. I had a video, and I didn't think I could show it with these screens so far apart. But I got a video of meeting the first kids on that shanty town. And the little girl, Sandra, we asked her where she goes to school, and she says, KPS. And I said, what does that stand for? She says, Kennedy. Kennedy what? Kennedy Private School. And so it's not Kennedy as in your erstwhile president, but it's Kennedy in a Nigerian name. And that was one of 32 private schools we found in that shanty town alone. Or I went to Kenya, to Nairobi, to the slum called Kibera, perhaps one of the most famous slums in the world. And there, when you come across a boy like Frank here, before I started doing this research, people would assume, he goes to public school or he's out of school altogether. But no, go with him down into the slum and you'll find that he's there at a tiny little private school right in the center of the slum, one of nearly 100 private schools in that slum itself. Nearly 100 private schools. And then all around the world, this is a global phenomenon. Rural China. I was giving a talk at a conference like this in Beijing. And if any of you have been to Beijing recently, you'll realize how rich it is. But I said, well, you know, Nigeria, India, there are these low-cost private schools serving poor communities. Could this be the same in China? And people were a bit embarrassed by the question, to be honest. And then someone from the British aid agency, DFID, put his hand up from the floor and said, DFID works in the poorest parts of China, Gansu province in the northwest. And we're working in the poorest villages, and we can tell you categorically there are no low-cost private schools there. So this was a bit of a red rag to this bull. And I went back to Newcastle, and as luck would have it, or as he was saying in this conference hall, as Providence would have it, a student arrived from China. And I asked where he was from. He said, from Gansu province. I said, do you mind if we go to Gansu province? I've got something we want to look for there together. So this student, Liu Chang, you can see him there. He's now a professor at Beijing Normal University. We went looking. We got up early in the morning, talked to mothers in markets, and we got some directions. Yes, there could be private schools here or there. We abandoned our vehicle. It was suitable only for three-wheelers. We went traveling into the mountains where people were doing harvesting like they've been doing for hundreds of years. And sure enough, at the end of this route, we came across a low-cost private school, People's Hearts, Mingjing, where the children sang in a choir to me, don't turn your eyes on these beautiful people. And it was one of 586 low-cost private schools in the mountains of Gansu, which no one knew about. And everyone you spoke to even denied their existence. So this is an extraordinary picture. Just how many are there? There's a chart there. Lagos State is perhaps the most studied for private schools. Lagos State in Nigeria. There are 14,000 low-cost private schools there. 70% of children in Lagos State go to private school. Only 26% are in government schools. And in fact, that figure is typical across the urban developing world. New Delhi, Hyderabad, Nairobi, Accra in Ghana, about 70% of the kids will be in private schools, including poor kids in low-cost private schools. And in the rural areas, surveys show that it's about 30%. In South Asia, and my guess it's true in West Africa too. So this is a huge phenomenon, and the phenomenon has great social impact. I could show you lots of tables, but you can just believe me for now that study after study shows that the children in the low-cost private schools outperform those in the public schools when all the proper statistical controls are done, and they outperform them for a fraction of the cost. So this is something really to celebrate. There's also social impact. So I could show you table after table of the schools in West Africa and different parts of the world where there's gender parity in the private schools. Gender parity. But even in communities like parts of rural Pakistan where Malala goes to school or went to school, where you've got private schools in a village, the gender gap between those in and out of school narrows from 16 percentage points to 8 percentage points in the villages where there are private schools. So this is just an extraordinary success story that's going on in different parts of the world. When I started talking about this, first of all, there were lots of people in denial, lots of critics. People can be quite aggressive when you touch on 65 years of development dogma and say the poor are helping themselves in different ways to what you expected. But one of the criticisms I did take to heart, people told me, well, you've looked at Kenya, you looked at Ghana, India. These are not the world's poorest places. You can't really say private schools are good for the poor, as one of my publications said. And I took this seriously, Father. I took this seriously, and I said, okay, where are the world's most difficult places? And perhaps they're like Somalia here, where I took this picture of an abandoned tank. Perhaps they're like Somalia. Perhaps they are the war-torn places in Africa. And this is I went to Somaliland in the north of Somalia, and this is a functioning low-cost private school, the 17th May Institute for Maths and Languages, a functioning private school in a bombed-out building. Went to Sierra Leone shortly after the war, and these are children of stone breakers. You know, the big stones are broken by their mothers and fathers into smaller stones, and their big brothers, and the smaller stones are sold to build roads and airfields around the world. And they went to private school as well, shortly after the war in the most primitive conditions you can see. But the private schools came in and flourished. And in Liberia, I went to 5 of the largest slums of Monrovia in Liberia. They had great names. One was called West Point, nothing to do with your academy, I don't think. Another was called Doe Community. There was one called Chicken Soup Factory. No prizes for guessing why it was called that. Another was called Red Light. Now, you'd be wrong to guess. You'd be wrong. That was named after the functioning traffic light in Monrovia. But in these communities, again, private school after private school, including this one here, I said to my guide, oh, the Americans will love a picture of this school. And he said innocently, well, who's Ronald Reagan? He said. Private school after private school. But and so this is just something to celebrate. This is something extraordinary, and this is a picture of children in a low-cost private school in rural Ghana celebrating. And really, that's what I've been doing ever since about this. But why? Let's just be clear on one issue. Remember that I told you about the parents in India saying their children are abandoned in the government schools. This is a picture across the developing world, in poor areas. Not to say there are not some good government schools, of course there are. But across the developing world, parents see their children being abandoned in the government schools. Now, we made a film for the BBC in Makoko, that shanty town built on stilts that I showed you pictures of. We were filming in Kennedy Private School and others. And then we got permission to film in the public school, the government school. And we again announced. We went with the Deputy Minister of Education. And the BBC cameraman was there, and the very first classroom we went in, the teacher was fast asleep at his desk. And there was a little girl teaching the class. And in the next class, there was no teacher. And then most of the teachers were sitting outside in the shade, and they'd set some work for their kids, and they were eating peanuts, drinking tea, and that sort of thing. And I would not have shown this poor fellow on the BBC film, and I would not have shown it to an audience like this in Lagos, Nigeria, with the Minister of Education present, if it hadn't been something that you see all the time, and that breaks your heart when you're going to poor communities. You see this sort of thing going on, children abandoned, but then, thank God, in the private schools, there's energetic teaching. Now, this conference is about good profit, and all the data I've told you so far, I've talked about private schools rather sort of running, rather being rather loose with my definition, are they for-profit or non-profit? As Iqbal said, non-government or... I like that definition, by the way. I always have to fight with the international community now. I call these schools private, but following what Iqbal said earlier, the development experts, they don't call them private, they call them non-state providers. Anyway, but we've done work now, and we've looked at how many of the schools are actually profit and non-profit. And this is data from the schools we found in the slums of Monrovia itself. Now, I don't know if you can read that, but basically the largest chunk, 61% of the schools we found were for profit. That is, they were owned by a proprietor, and any surplus would come back to the proprietor, him or herself. rather than go to any other organization. There's only a tiny number of government schools there, but you see there's this next largest group was the private independent churches. They were the typical evangelical type churches you see in these poor communities, typically set up by a person, a pastor, who then runs a school, and then the private established churches like the Catholic Church, the Episcopalian, the Wesleyan in Monrovia, they make up about 13.4% of the schools. So we have a picture, the private schools are, majority of them, and this is typical in our studies, the largest number of them, or the majority of them, are for-profit. And in the Liberia Household Survey, just to remind us of that figure, 71% of the children are in private schools, even in the poorest slums in Monrovia, one of the, I guess, the poorest slums in the world. You can look at how these private schools are affordable. This is one of their virtues. This is looking again at the for-profit schools. Yes, there are fees that are expensive. So when you're thinking about the poor, people say, how can this idea be pro-poor if the children have to pay fees in the schools? Well, children have to pay fees, and yes, if you look at that graph there, you'll see that the fees at the private schools are many times more than the small levies that are charged in the government school. The blue is the government schools, the red is the private schools. But going to school, there's not only fees you have to pay if you're poor, if you're anyone. You have to buy shoes if you're poor. You have to buy uniform. You have to buy books. You have to pay transport. All these other extra costs. And if you add those in, if you see the middle set of bars there, the cost of sending a child to a private school for the other costs actually is the same as the cost of the other costs in a government school. Not surprisingly, the uniform, books, they all cost about the same. So if you add those things together, the fees and the other costs, you see the combined fees there. And yes, sending a child to a private school is more expensive, but the cost to a parent of sending a child to a government school turns out, a typical figure we found, about 75% of the cost of sending a child to a private school. In other words, these schools are affordable, and they're not much less affordable than sending a child to a supposedly free government school. I've mentioned churches in Monrovia, and it might be worth, for this audience especially, showing that the established church schools, the Catholic schools, the Wesleyan schools, in the poor areas, they don't actually necessarily charge fees that are cheaper, as you'd expect, than the for-profit proprietor-driven schools. In fact, the proprietor-driven schools, we found the median fee was about 4,000 Liberian dollars a year, compared to nearly 5,000 in the established church schools. Indeed, my slide has slipped there, I think, but the green, I got a green area, a blue, and a red area there. The red area shows where a church has set up a school and there's no relationship in terms of funding between it. The blue area, which is about 34%, that shows what we expect to happen, doesn't it? A church in a poor area has set up a school, and the church subsidizes the school to some extent. But the green area shows something quite unexpected, I think, to many people. The green area shows where, and it's about 18% of the schools we found, that shows where the church has set up a school, but the school subsidizes the church. There's no philanthropic relationship from church to school. The church is actually a bit of a money earner for the church itself. This is a map of Juba. You can see the White Nile there, the river down the end there. And I just want, this is really to show you that I've been very busy, this map. But if we are able to locate each of those schools carefully, and based on our knowledge of Juba, there's a young chap here who was in Juba. I spoke to him yesterday. If you remember Juba, and you'll see that the for-profit schools, the yellow, are actually in the most difficult places to reach, the most deprived areas. The non-profits are also there to a certain extent. The government schools are in the easy areas. They're in the city centre. They're in the safe, easy areas. In other words, for-profit schools reach the parts other schools do not reach. I think there was a beer advert, something like that once. Now, finally, on this evidence from the for-profit versus the non-profit, this again is from South Sudan. And this graph shows the number of schools that are there, and the red line going down shows when the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, was declared in 2005 in South Sudan. And as you can see from that graph, the number of schools increased quite a lot after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was declared. Terrific. We can disaggregate all those schools, and we get this rather messy graph here, where that shows the private proprietor schools, the non-government schools, the community, the church, and various other, and the government schools itself. So you can see there's quite an interesting picture there, but the two that are most interesting, if you take them out, are the private proprietor schools, the for-profit schools, and the church schools. And what's been happening there? You've got a peace dividend. You've got a peace dividend of, yes, churches coming in and opening schools, but even more so, private proprietors coming in and opening schools. They are the largest number. They are serving more of the poor than anyone else. So I could carry on about the virtues of the for-profit sector, but in the remainder of my time, I just want to talk about what happens when outsiders get involved in this. Father said some kind words at the beginning of this, but since my research and since the publication of The Beautiful Tree, there has been a movement going on, a movement emerging, and lots of outsiders are getting involved in the low-cost education space now. As was pointed out, I've created a couple of co-founded a few chains of schools myself. Omega Schools in Ghana, based just outside Accra in the community called Kaswa, which is on the Cape Coast, on the road to Cape Coast, as a Cardinal will know. I co-founded a chain of schools, and very quickly we grew to 38 schools with nearly 20,000 children. We were focusing on the poor communities, and very soon we realized that the cash flow of the poor is daily. So most of our mothers were daily traders. Many of the fathers were absent. But if they were working, they would also be daily paid, or laborers, daily paid laborers, for instance. And we talked to parents, and they said to us, the private schools, we want to send our children to private school. But the private schools, even for the poor, they charge fees termly, every 3 months. So even though the fees might only be $5 to $7 per month, you've got to save up $15 to $20 to pay the fees. And if you're poor, it's always hard to save up money. You know, there's always other calls on your income. And if you're poor, then you pay the fees, and then you get hit by other costs, the PTA fees, you've got to buy uniforms. So we listened to those problems and said, okay, why don't we create an all-inclusive daily fee? We worked out the total cost of schooling over the year, including uniform, books, transport, lunch, etc., and we divided it by the number of days in the school year, and the parents could come and pay that fee per day. This was amazingly popular. When we first opened our schools, hundreds of parents wanted to come there. It's amazingly popular and terrible to administer. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But slowly we got used to different ways of organizing it, and eventually we've got vendors in the community. They come to our head office, they buy, what's really a currency, get into Omega school cards, and then they sell them in the community, including at the school gate in the morning, so we can be cash free. And we also give them 1.5% commission, so we again create new jobs in the communities. That's been very successful. Bridge, I've been very quiet about, but Bridge International Academies is now the largest chain of schools anywhere in the world. The co-founder, Jay Kimmelman, came to see me after I'd published this idea of chains of low-cost private schools. He came to see me, and I recommended he open in Kenya. And they're now 150,000 children around the world. Tremendously successful. And then I've created a couple of brands, the Cadmus brands, as Father mentioned. There's one in Honduras, Cadmus Academies, and Cadmus Education in India. Cadmus Education, a couple of years old, we've got 6,000 kids who are going to grow to about 50,000 hopefully soon. And Cadmus in Honduras, just a year old, we've got 2 schools there in poor areas of Tegucigalpa. But let me finish by, first of all, just summarizing 2 things that occurred to me at 4 o'clock in the morning, suffering from jet lag. You know, when outsiders get involved, I mean, this is trite in a way, but it's worth stating profit is good in these businesses if any profit is reinvested in the education business in order to further improve the education and social impact already found in the sector, the sort of things I've been describing already. But it's also true, of course, that any profit is good if it's used as a signal to potential investors that the business is worth investing in to further improve the environment. So in other words, profit to me is good, whether you give it in dividends or you reinvest it. So that much is clear, I think. But there are some problems when outsiders get involved. And the first one is definitely, it's a mea culpa, really. It's some people, like myself, perhaps got involved in the sector in order to prove the point. I wanted to prove something about the role of education, the role of government in education. You know, I was a philosopher of education. I wanted to prove some point about the role of government in education. And I was not really focused enough on profit. Too little focus on profit, I think, if you're in the for-profit business, can be a danger, almost as much as too much focus on profit. I can discuss this one-on-one afterwards, but it's a bit like, to me, it's just, I didn't really care if the business was evaluated at $500,000 or $1 million. It didn't matter to me. It mattered very much to the business partners I was taking on this journey. I didn't really care if I put some money in and didn't sign a particular document. It mattered very much when later people are trying to work out what goes where in a business. So too little emphasis on profit can be bad as well. But some of the big providers are coming in and picking unnecessary fights with regulators, and this is a serious problem. Let me finish by talking about regulations. These are perhaps one of the chief impediments in the private school market. Fortunately, regulations are bad on schools, but there are federations of low-cost private school providers that have been created to fight some of these regulations. And this is a wonderful federation in Nigeria, the Association, it's a great Nigerian name, the Association of Formidable Education Development. This is the one that's got 5,000 members with nearly 1 million kids. And in case you can't spot me, I'm the one in the middle of that photograph. And we're fighting, and it's just come up, we've got to fight another fight. Rivers State in Nigeria now, the oil-rich state. The governor there wants to close 2,000 private schools. Another fight is on, another struggle to try and convince them that these schools are worth protecting. And I seem to be engaged in fights all the time here. This is in India, in Punjab. The Punjab government is closing 2,000 low-cost private schools. So I was given this ceremonial dagger, and I held it aloft, perhaps unwisely, saying, we will fight. We will fight the government in closing these schools. But let me close. Let me close by saying, yes, this is the most exciting business to be involved in, the most exciting journey to be involved in. It's not always easy. This is in Honduras, in a very poor community. If you know Central America, the gangs are there. And this area was in Gang 18 territory. I think it's named after the 18th of November. And you could tell that because the gang throws tennis shoes over all the wires. And so you know that territory. Anyway, here we're just talking to the mothers about opening this new, very low-cost private school in this community. And we had a picture because all the mothers said they would send their children to this school. And then the guy who sent me this photograph, he did that red circle. He said, did you see the guy behind you? I said, no. And so I enlarged the photograph, and there is the guy behind me. He's a gang member going like this. Can you see him on the photograph? I don't know what that sign means, but I assume he was saying, you're very welcome in the community. That's what I took from that. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
That was terrific. James, you're amazing. Social entrepreneurship on steroids. Oh, James, I want to thank you very, very much. First of all, for the complete inspiration. Beyond the message about profit, I mean, you're just social entrepreneurship on steroids. I mean, we just love it. I think, my huge takeaway is, does profitability work in the private sector in education? Absolutely. And he's proven the thesis worldwide with this extraordinary effort. And I think it just brings to the fore that, profit does lead to the good when you can sort of resist all of these government regulations, resist the corruption, resist the gangs and so forth, as he's tried to do by creating or helping to create these federations. But also it shows how education can help these educational models, because in the beautiful tree he does, he has kind of refined a model for private education federations, private education financing, daily financing. That, of course, this is what normal entrepreneurs are trying to do, and he's done it for the poor, and he's done it out of the goodness of his heart. And I just think if there are outsiders who want to invest in this, talk to James Tooley, because I think this is probably one of the most worthwhile efforts in the world to bringing the poor literally not only out of their poverty, but to the creativity of good profit. So thank you very, very much, James, for a totally edifying talk. I don't believe we're having a break before Catherine Pakaluk, so I'm going to just launch right into her introduction. I'm sorry? Oh. I think many of you are well aware of Catherine Pakaluk. She is a member of our board of our board of directors at the Napa Institute. She is also someone who has been present at most of our Napa conferences, both Napa West and Napa East. She also is a professor here of economics at the Bush Business School, CUA. And also, prior to that, she was the chairman of the Department of Economics at Ave Maria University. She did her doctoral degree at Harvard University in economics, writing essays in microeconomic application. And in addition to that, she has studied Catholic social teaching with a very good friend of mine, Russell Hittinger, and Thomistic theology with another very good friend of mine, Stephen Long. And of course, you'll see that she is just masterful at bringing together family studies, economic analysis, social teachings of the Catholic Church, and a variety of other disciplines, just weaving them all together as only Catherine can do in a remarkable essay, a remarkable talk that will share with us how to put good profit into action. So our great board member, Catherine Pakaluk.
Absolutely too much. Thank you, Father, for that overwhelming introduction. I'm going to weave a lot of things together, but I'm not sure I'm going to weave together any of the particular things that Father mentioned, so I hope I'm not kind of getting off base this morning. I also want to say how much I enjoyed the previous talk. In my regular life as an economist, I study private education and incentives and different ways of thinking about it. So I need to find our previous speaker after this talk and find out more about what he's up to. So I'm glad to be speaking about putting good profit into action. This morning, I was reminded earlier this week at a colloquium discussion on political economy that economists don't know anything about making money. I will volunteer of my own accord that economists are also not particularly practical people. We don't know much about putting anything into action. So I fear that my title might be the most misleading title for this whole conference. And as they say, I'm also the only thing standing between you and lunch, and possibly your taxis to the airport. So these are 2 strikes against me. My goal then, since it won't be about making money and it won't be particularly practical, is to provide a little material for reflection and maybe inspiration as you leave here. So I want to proceed where economists might be good, if they are good. And so I will begin by laying a little bit of groundwork, quoting the best-loved passages about good economists. And this one, I can do this well. There we go. So this is from Friedrich Bastiat's What is Seen and What is Not Seen, published in 1848. And he says, in the economic sphere, an act, a habit, or an institution, a law, produces not only one effect, but a series of effects. One of these effects, the first alone, is immediate. It appears simultaneously with its cause. It is seen. The other effects emerge only subsequently. They are not seen, and we are fortunate if we foresee them. There is only one difference, then, between a bad economist and a good one. The bad economist confines himself to the visible effect. The good economist takes into account both the effect that can be seen and those that must be foreseen. And this difference is tremendous, for it almost always happens that when the immediate consequence is favorable, the later consequences are disastrous, and vice versa. Whence it follows that the bad economist pursues a small present good, followed by a great evil to come, and the good economist pursues a great good to come at the risk of small present evil or cost. Okay, so this is just groundwork for me. All right, so in the interest of weaving things together, 160 years after Bastiat published this commentary on the 6th of September in 2008, the 23-year-old climber Alex Honnold recorded the following entry in his journal: 9608, regular northwest face 511D, question mark, solo 250 en route, the 510 bypass, sketchy on the slab. So this is an image of what we're talking about. Sketchy on the slab. The regular northwest face refers to the northwest face of Half Dome, the iconic granite peak in Yosemite's National Park. The regular northwest face of Half Dome is about 2,200 vertical feet of climbing, if you want to climb it, on surfaces that typically afford only the merest suggestion of handholds and footholds. The easy sections, like the one that you see in this photo, contain long vertical cracks just big enough to insert 1 or 2 fingers. The difficult sections are wide, flat slabs that often require the arduous skill of smearing. The smearing is the act of pressing one's sole of the climbing shoe directly onto the rock or the slab and using friction only to propel oneself upwards. The northwest face of Half Dome is a route that only a small number of people will ever attempt in what is called a free climb, which is with a harness clipped into ropes that are tacked up by the climber along the way up. In such a climb, the climber really does all the climbing. She never uses the ropes to bear her weight or to get over tough spots. And when one has completed a climb, one has really climbed it. It's sometimes said that the route has been freed. I have other, okay, here's Half Dome, another picture of Half Dome. It's pretty iconic. It's actually just gorgeous. And this is the route that he climbed. But on 9608, Alex Honnold ascended this route that you see here with no ropes and no harnesses. No ropes and no harnesses. This style of climb is called a free solo, or free soloing. Earlier in the same year, on April 1st, Alex had catapulted to climbing fame for his free solo of the Moonlight Buttress in Zion Canyon. I think I have a picture of this. This is also Half Dome, sorry. Also Half Dome. Let's see why it's called Half Dome. Here's the Moonlight Buttress. Moonlight Buttress is 1,200 feet tall. So John Long, who's one of the early climbers who pioneered a lot of the routes in Yosemite in the 70s, had said of this climb of Half Dome, he said, "There isn't anything I can think of that requires that level of concentration for that length of time, with the penalty being certain death if you make a small mistake. All right, so that's pretty impressive, right? But I want to suggest that John Long might have done well to hold off on his comment. So 4 months ago, from today, 4 months ago, in early June of this year, Alex Honnold got up in the morning, drove into Yosemite. This is an easy section, by the way. Put on his climbing shoes, chalked up, and climbed this rock, which is known as the Dawn Wall of El Capitan, without ropes. It took him 4 hours to free solo this 3,000-foot piece of rock. Legendary climber Tommy Caldwell, who still climbs and climbs with Alex many times, he says this was the most significant event in the sport of climbing in all of his own 38 years that he can remember. This was written up in the New York Times afterwards in June. This is when I sort of started to think about it. In June, it was Daniel Duane, writing in the New York Times, said that this should have been celebrated as one of the greatest athletic feats of any kind ever. Right? So Duane argues, look, climbing has subdisciplines that call for different genetic traits and venerate different accomplishments. I don't know if you follow any of the documentaries of the climbers in the Himalayas, and you add all these difficult things of climbing along with the cold and the extreme. And he says, well, look, free soloing requires the capacity to tolerate, in addition to these things, the extreme fear of falling and sustain this over minutes and hours. Free soloing, he says, is a distillation of the entire climbing world's collective fantasy life. Vanishingly few elite climbers make careers out of free soloing, and plenty call it irresponsible and deplorable. But in their heart of hearts, they all recognize it as the final word. I'm sorry, I'm quoting the New York Times, the final word in badassery. In words somewhat more refined, we might say that free soloing is something like the Platonic ideal of climbing. Duane concludes his piece. He says, reasonable people consider projects like these idiotic to the point of outrage. That is perfectly defensible. If you count yourself among those inclined to negative judgment, and even if you don't, I hope you'll indulge a mental exercise. Allow your mind to relax into the possibility that Honnold's climb was not at all reckless, that he really was born with unique neural architecture and physical gifts, and that his years of dedication really did develop those gifts to the point where he could not only make every move on El Cap without rest, he could do so with a tolerably minuscule chance of falling. Viewed in that light, Honnold's free solo of El Cap represents a miraculous opportunity for the rest of us to experience what you might call the human sublime, a performance so far beyond our current understanding of our physical and mental potential that it provokes a pleasurable sensation of mystified awe, right alongside inevitable nausea. Let's see, I have a couple of other pictures here. This is the route that Alex climbed. It's called the Freerider route. There are dozens and dozens of routes up the El Cap. So the question I want to ask in the remainder of the time is, why is this activity called free? As in free solo or free climb. And how is it related to great human achievement and the human sublime? So I say that, let's see, I've actually got a couple more photos here. I like this one because you can see this is Alex climbing El Capitan, but with Half Dome in the back. So I might leave this here as a backdrop for us. Here's another picture of him. What else do I have here? So I'll leave this here to look at. So why is this called free? So I want to mark out at least 4 obvious attributes. Eventually I'll get around to profit, by the way. So 4 obvious attributes. So the first is the willed and desired cultivation of unique capabilities, right? Unique talents. So everybody recognizes there's something, unique about, Alex has certain gifts and capacities that the rest of us don't have and the rest of climbers don't have. So the second, and I should almost put this first, is something like high risk, high reward. So certain death is a risk, yes, but also the pursuit of something noble and rare and valuable. And in this sense, value, we're thinking about value as something that's related to its scarcity. This is rare and noble. The third thing is obvious mental and physical suffering, so pain and hardship of the climb itself. And the fourth thing is this intense preparation. So free climbing, what we call free, without the ropes, without other assists, requires more preparation and not less. So the other three are a little bit evident already. Certain death, this is evident, high risk, special capabilities. But what about more preparation? I want to say something about this. So Duane, writing about this, says that Honnold rehearses big free solos like this one. We think of genius sometimes and this kind of great accomplishment as something that people are inspired. They wake up in the morning and they just go out and do it. We look at great athletes this way across the board, in fact. It's never true. So he says Honnold rehearses his big free solos on ropes first. He commutes up and down cliffs with a lot of gear in order to work for entire days on small, tricky sections. I'm going to go back to this picture of the routes. You can't maybe see the text in there, but it kind of points to these tricky sections. You know, here's a section where there's just nothing to hang on to. Just absolutely not. I mean, you think, like, how do you do this? So he'll rope himself up and then practice these sections for days. Duane also says he memorizes long sequences of complex movement, like a middle schooler memorizing pi to 100 decimal places. He's methodically bested the marquee climbs of every Yosemite free soloist before him, and he spent years quietly preparing himself for the free solo to end all free solos. In the final weeks, Honnold told me he climbed a particularly smooth stretch of the rock about 500 feet up on rope 5 times in a row with just his feet, no hands. I mean, so if you're going to put yourself up there with no ropes, I mean, you're going to make darn sure, like, even if my hand doesn't work, my feet will make it. I mean, this is amazing. So I want to suggest here, as I've suggested elsewhere, this point about preparation, that the great climbers of the world who consider free soloing the ideal of human achievement in climbing are not wrong. They're not wrong to call this freedom. For freedom in the human sphere involves a kind of fruitful marriage between human artistry, creative genius, and will, and the mastery of the building blocks of nature, what we might in other contexts call principles or rules. This conception of freedom is inherently connected to human achievement. There is no freedom, we would say, without mastery. You can't let go of the ropes unless you've really mastered this thing. But the greater the mastery, the greater the potential for human achievement. Mastery here isn't sufficient for human achievement, but it is necessary. So mastery, together with human desire or will and genius, inherent capabilities, always combine in any case of genuine human accomplishment. What constitutes then great human achievement or great accomplishment? And it seems that great achievement is marked by having a lot of the 4 characteristics I mentioned earlier, suggesting that these things admit of degrees. There can be a great capability or a small one, a great talent or a small one, large risk and small risk, so much ventured and much gained, right? Great suffering and small suffering. And there can be great mastery and kind of mediocre mastery. So great achievement, what we all intuitively consider greatness, is marked by these things. For instance, a great achievement for a statesman would require the cultivation of natural talents and gifts, which of course has something to do with will as well, mastery of principles of rhetoric and negotiation, political acumen, but also for a great achievement. A statesman would have exercised this mastery in a time of crisis or high risk, right? You know, if there's nothing crazy happens in the political, it's hard to say this was a great statesman. We measure this greatness in respect to some crisis or time of high risk or high value. It was absolutely clutch that you led us through this time, right? Without this leadership, we might have been on the brink of war. So a time when great value comes from the action. And finally, we would recognize that the effort required to achieve this result cost him a great deal of suffering. Therefore, we might rightly call most free those men and women whose accomplishments are most great. And this is kind of fascinating. And I think, well, it's why I've claimed just now that those who call Honnold's activity free are quite right. We might even go so far as to say that the greatest of the free solo climbers, Alex Honnold, is the freest climber we can think of. He might also be the craziest or the most reckless, but we're going to set aside questions of ethics of climbing. So in the last remaining minutes I have with you, I want to turn to the consideration of good profit and a lot of what Charles Koch put in his book. Market-based management, he says in the introduction to his book, is extremely powerful, but successfully applying it is neither simple nor easy. Okay, so you can start to see where I'm going with this. After more than 5 decades spent developing and applying these principles at Coke, I've learned it's not enough to simply memorize the methodology or learn your way around the metaphorical toolbox. Successful application of market-based management requires internalizing its principles at all levels of the organization, especially in leadership. So it sounds like mastery to me. If you've never swung a golf club or driven a car before, theory and instruction only get you so far. You need to pick up a club and get behind the wheel and keep practicing and practicing until you internalize the mechanics to the point where you can do so automatically. It needs to become second nature to you. So this is what Alex does. I mean, for whatever reason, this is second nature to him at this point. Apparently, he was climbing since he was a small baby. I mean, he was born to climb. We could spy then in this passage that Koch describes something that's kind of profound, but it's easy to miss. And this is captured by the claim he makes later in more general terms, that there are real and existing principles that we might call rules or laws that govern the natural world and social reality, like, okay, the law of gravity is a real thing, and that these principles can be discovered by us, mastered through study and practice. But this is not limited to the natural world that we typically think of it. These things also apply to social institutions and business enterprises and society itself. And this is one of the kind of key unifying principles of good profit. So this leads me to my first principle, inspired by Bastiat, what is not seen. In Honnold's case, we intuitively and immediately notice that there are principles which govern his ability to balance and propel himself upward on great slabs of rock. Amazingly, when we look at the difference then between great businesses and poor ones, we often tend to think the difference is explained by luck or fate or a priori distribution of advantages and disadvantages. It's easier to see in the case of climbing. It's less easy to see in the case of business enterprise. Thus, good profit requires mastery of learned principles of success. Honnold climbs a section 5 times with just his feet. Good profit requires hard work, hard practice. Anyone who's attempted golf knows just how apt Koch's golf example is. There is no easy way to swing like a pro. And even with a great deal of talent, someone like Jordan Spieth, we have an insane number of practicing hours. No one can ever really appreciate, I mean, you just don't know. You don't want to know how much time these guys spend practicing. They make it look easy. So what then about the characteristic of free activity that I highlighted as sort of suffering or pain or personal struggle? This too is implicit in the passage I quoted from Koch. In business, Koch says we aren't mastering or practicing something easy. Principles of market-based management, like the principles of a good golf swing, are difficult to execute even when the skills have been mastered and practiced. If this weren't true, then winning major golf tournaments wouldn't be so elusive, even for the world's greatest masters of the game. And there's lots of touching and kind of moving passages that Alex writes about his climbs, you know, where even after executing everything, practicing, it costs him tremendous effort to accomplish these climbs. He gets to the top and kind of looks around at the top of, I think, Half Dome, and he looks around and he says, there's all these tourists up there because they can get up through a regular route, you know, the back of Half Dome. And he kind of gets up there. He said it was like parachuting out of Vietnam into some, and he said these people with their cameras and they're munching on Doritos, and they had no idea that he just almost died, you know, that he just came through this thing. So, you know, but the execution of it, even with all that preparation, is still a tremendous amount of effort, right? Golfers who win a major tournament often report just kind of collapsing at the end of 4 days. It's a lot of sustained concentration over 4 days. So the physical exertion of a climb, like the free ascent of El Cap, is readily seen. We might even readily assess the mental effort of keeping something like maximal fear under control for a length of 4 hours, all while exerting maximal physical energy. When we look at successful businessmen, we don't readily see the days, the weeks, and the years of sustained concentration, the effort and the planning that go into the practice of the work, all while tolerating the fear, the natural fear of losing great capital, for example, committed to ventures. This doesn't only apply to the men and the women at the top. If market-based management is practiced correctly, each member of the firm community is an entrepreneur because he or she has property rights over her area and incentives that reward personal investment of time, energy, focus, execution. There is sacrifice and hardship at every level. What is not seen, the execution of learned mastery sustained over long periods of time, reinforced in hundreds of decisions. This is the lifeblood of the business enterprise. You kind of know if you're going about it right, if it's hard. It should be hard. The ideas of risk and value, or in Honnold's case, a certain death versus great honor, are readily applied to principled entrepreneurship. There's another picture here. Sort of look at the menacing rocks at the bottom. In the first case, we know that business ventures necessarily involve risk of capital. Koch says, for instance, there were certainly times when fate was against us, and our investments, despite all of our efforts, were unprofitable. But had we been unwilling or without sufficient capital to invest, we never would have distinguished ourselves from our competition. But the other side of the balance, which is the other side of the balance of risk is value, is kind of more interesting. Value is the thing that is noble, rare, and coveted, like climbing El Capitan. I would like to propose that it is the quest of creating real value for others and in consequence contributing to the overall development of persons that we would like to think about, this big focus of Koch's book. And I'm going to quote, at the end he says he had a letter from a former employee, many such letters. "You had such a positive impact on me early in my career at Koch," says one of his employees, "so much so that Sue and I named our first son after you. I know I never told this to you or anyone else." So this is, that's the quest, right? The quest is, profit is sort of symbolic of another set of things that are unseen. There's all this value, and value is unseen, and it's personal. So in business, unlike on granite, the crisis points or the fields for human greatness are usually hidden. Good profit, market-based management, as Koch describes it, asks that businessmen get up every day, chalk up their hands, and take very seriously the ways that they impact the human beings they are responsible for, and I'm going to say responsible for. Real human lives and well-being depend upon it. And again, this is the importance of what is not seen. So finally, I want to mention the first aspect of this free activity that I talked about, the willed or desired cultivation of natural gifts and talents. Koch says at one point, by developing their individual capabilities, employees make a greater contribution, find greater fulfillment in work, and are more likely to reach their maximum potential. We strive to make career choices available to them based on their aptitudes and interests. Okay, so far so good. And then he doesn't say so directly, but I will say that it seems that this principle is critical for the entrepreneur. Koch is not referring to himself in a certain sense, but that the field of free enterprise allowed him to develop his own genius, his own innate capabilities. But here's an interesting thing, is that talents and capabilities are most often unseen. We don't always know what we're best at. Many people don't know, and as Charles mentioned yesterday, school is often not a very good place to discover what you're good at. It kind of tests and shows us a few narrow types of things. You could discover you're good at math problems, for example. But this is a very narrow piece of the many, many varied types of things we might be really great at. We don't know. So how do we know what we're good at? How would I make a choice in favor of something I'm good at unless we've had a chance to try many things? Athletic talents, like creative ones, require a field or a canvas or a big rock for discovery, practice, and execution. I suppose then that the pursuit of good profit, kind of vast free enterprise field, connects persons with their own innate talents or gives them the opportunity. Now, it's necessary in that some people will be trying things that they're not good at, and then they learn this, and then there's a kind of a frustrating process, but this cannot be directed always with the kind of efficiency we would like. You try things and fail. So I want to say that economic theory, if you at least studied principles at some point, speaks of revealed preferences, that we have these subjective preferences and we don't always know them, but our choices in the market reveal our preferences. And I think that a good theory of free enterprise would speak of revealed talents. Right? That this way of exercising human creativity in the business enterprise helps to reveal talents that we didn't know we had or others had. And this is a really splendid thing, if you think about it, right? So to finish up, and I don't know if I have more pictures of Alex climbing here. This is just another one, give you a sense of how scary this looks. Those of you who started a business from the ground up know that this is probably pretty apt, right? It's like really, really scary, right? So what I've been sketching up to now, is something like an argument for what Koch calls good profit, or what we might also want to call principled entrepreneurship, which I would like to say is something like the ordered experience, we'll save that for later, the rightly ordered experience of human freedom and economic initiative. I've kind of argued along the way that this rightly ordered human freedom in the economic sphere can aspire to what we consider great human achievement. Right? So when Dwayne, writing in the New York Times, said, well, this should be considered one of the great feats of all time. I mean, building a great business can be considered one of the great human feats of all time. So it's ordered to this. The building of a great business corresponds to the richest and most intuitive notions of what we call free human activity. When I said that Honnold might be called the freest climber of all, I meant that he was more free. Yes, there are no ropes on me. But also that his accomplishment freedom, I'm going to smush them together, accomplishment freedom, depended on more work, more mastery, more sacrifice, and more kind of cultivation of natural gifts than all other climbers. So this is special. It is great, right? If this is true, we might say that what Koch tries to outline, a philosophy of free enterprise based in the wisdom of his father, and developed over 60 plus years of study and hard work, it's something like the rules for free soloing in business. It's not just ordered to good profit, it's ordered to greatness. His father said to him, you can use this, the capital I'm bequeathing to you, I'm leaving to you. You can use this capital as a valuable tool for accomplishment, or you could squander it foolishly. If you choose to let this money destroy your initiative and independence, it will be a curse to you. I should regret very much to have you miss the glorious feeling of accomplishment. I know you are not going to let me down. That feeling of accomplishment is also not seen. And it comes, as Bastiat said, as the result of hundreds and thousands of small personal costs. Implicit in my argument for the relationship between free enterprise and human accomplishment is something like the Bastiat thesis. The good economist, Bastiat says, pursues a great good to come at the risk of small present cost. So also the good entrepreneur. Putting good profit into action requires just this: cultivating virtue, life of prayer, hard work, mastery, sweat, weariness, exhaustion, all in pursuit of a noble value that really serves, really is noble. Therefore, a better title for these remarks might have been In Defense of What Is Not Seen. Thank you. You're welcome.
Oh, no, that was great. That was terrific. We need some closet philosophy in this country.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Catherine. What we need in this conference is not only closet philosophy, but explicit philosophy. And honestly, I thought that was a great concluding talk for our conference, because it really does get down to the basics of human spirit. And after all, we've been sort of going around this little loop throughout the entire conference. Everything does link back, in a sense, to this transcendent spirit that we've been given. A transcendent spirit that desires accomplishment, a transcendent spirit that can even transcend itself and discipline itself and master things, a transcendent spirit that goes beyond. And literally, the idea of beyondness is connected with spirit, that not only goes beyond, but it literally goes beyond in desire, and beyond in the acceptance of suffering, beyond in the anticipation of accomplishment and doing a great good for the other. What you've given us here, Catherine, I think, is this ability in this definition of freedom to look at what the real core dimension of good profit and entrepreneurship is. A human spirit undaunted, liberated by a proper notion of freedom, and oriented toward an objective that is good and great, not only for ourselves, but for as many people around us as possible. A good spirit created, transcendent in the image of God. Thank you so very, very much for that incredible, enlightening talk. Well, we've come a long way over the last 3 days, really, 2 complete days if we count everything from start to finish. And we've started this little journey together with Andreas Widmer's definition of good profit, seeking the good for customers, for vendors, employees, investors, and society. And we've added later, of course, to this whole idea of even environment and international society throughout the conference. And then we've explored in so many different ways what it means to be a good person, a good leader pursuing good profit, and looking at not only the ethical dimensions of integrity, or even the principled dimensions that we need to bring into our business, not only the right orientation toward keeping not only our affairs true to principle, but also keeping the idea of competition and higher order norms true to principle. We've talked certainly about all of the various ways and opportunities that we have to serve the good through good profit, both nationally, internationally, microeconomically, macroeconomically, and so many different panels, manifestations that really show how these very creative individuals, through these, their own efforts, have put all of these principles into practice. And of course, we had that great consolidation of these thoughts, with Charles Koch himself providing, as it were, the impetus and sort of the categories through which we've been reflecting throughout the last 3 days. And that, that idea of contribution of value to others as a primary principle, that idea of constantly challenging ourselves, falsifying what needs to be changed, and moving beyond, that idea of a big vision. But above all, that idea that integrity, in a way, trumps talent, that integrity is the true foundation upon which talent and good profit is built. We've heard certainly all of the various aspects, that impact upon this, the very good objectives of good profit that come with it, and concluded this conference with the idea of spirit, of true freedom, the idea of a transcendent spirit made in the image of God that was presented by Catherine just now. The idea, of course, of freedom is so important. Not just freedom in free enterprise, not just freedom in political freedom, but in that individual discipline that she was trying to exhort us onto. And that's the one point I'll just make at the end. This great Catholic philosopher, Gabriel Marcel, tried to use, Isaiah Berlin's, distinction between freedom from and freedom for in an individualistic, non-political sense that Catherine was addressing. And the idea was freedom from is the cage into which our culture has been put. We interpret freedom with getting our greatest emotional need met as soon as possible and escaping any kind of long-term commitment that could, hold us down, that could in some way impinge on our quote-unquote freedom. It's such a false notion of freedom, and it's killing us. It's killing free enterprise. It's killing our culture. And whoever believes it, especially our young people, are going to be trapped by it in their minds, never to be able to pursue the very kinds of accomplishment that Catherine addressed. But freedom for, there is the liberation of the human transcendent spirit. when I begin to think, no, I'm not free when I get out of commitments and keep all my options open. I am free when I discipline myself, when I master the art of the enterprise, when I am willing to take risks for a good beyond myself, willing to contribute value to others, willing to pursue the noble objective, willing to make as much of a contribution as I can make with my time, talents, and energy in a reasonable way, in a quantitatively risk-oriented way. I'm going to bring about the greatest good that I can to make the greatest possible difference, the greatest value to others, and I'm going to really work at it in the most disciplined fashion possible. Now there, amidst all that work, is the liberation of the spirit, the true definition of freedom, to which every great entrepreneur, every great practitioner of good profit is called. Just want to thank all of the speakers who've just put this together in a remarkable symphony that just brings so many different notes, so many different applications, so many different parts of the process together in looking at this great and noble ideal. Yes, good profit, which orients itself when it is unclouded by collusion and deceit, brings us to a better culture, a better society, and above all, to the common good that good profiteers desire. Thank you very, very much to you all. I'm going to just say thank you to a few people. Okay, I'm happy to do it, but I'll thank you then afterwards. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Well, we're just wrapping up, and Father has a couple of more words to say, but yesterday I kind of took that personal knowledge versus conceptual knowledge, and I realized that's what we're doing here all week. We're trying to make it personal knowledge, so when we go back into our secular culture hostile to these ideas, that we proceed to continue to incorporate good profit into our businesses and to spread that word to our friends, relatives, and neighbors. I want to thank John Meyer in particular. He's the executive director. Emily McCormick, who's been with me many years planning these events. Jen Healy, Carly, my executive director of the foundation, Kathleen O'Reilly, Brianna Marlino, who's a graduate of the Catholic University Business School here, that handles a lot of our marketing, and all the staff from the Catholic University of America, Beatrice Lopez and all of her staff, and the students that have supported us as volunteers. It was interesting. There's a student here, and his name was Charles Bush, but I thought it was Charles, and then it said like the Bush School or something, and I had no way this guy's name is Charles Bush. Well, his name is Charles Bush, spelled exactly the same way as my name, but it gets better. He was born and raised in a town that my family has owned the supermarkets in that town for 65 years, and it was just 10 miles from where I was born and raised, so Providence, you know. And I didn't know the guy, I didn't know the family. It was very strange, but he's still working here today. Anyway, Father Spitzer, I try to tell you this guy had a 200 IQ, and you wouldn't listen, but I think you're starting to get my drift. Yeah, you're starting to get my drift, but we had a great week. Hopefully in Providence, the Roman Catholic Church can learn from Charles Koch's Good Prophet and how it enhances its people and raises up the poor through the dialogue of Cardinal Turkson and Charles Koch and their respective organizations. So thank you. That next year, Napa East, if you will, or the conference, Dignity of Work, October 2nd through the 5th, so the same week, 2018. We'll be at the Mayflower Hotel and then one day here at the university. So it'll be a little bit more robust. Not that this wasn't robust. I think it was very robust, but we're gonna continue to up our game and continue to improve the whole experience. Although those cigar nights, I'm glad I cut out of there, fairly early. I guess 2 a.m. this morning it went. So that's where all the fun happens too. And also, I thank Archbishop Neisted, who led us in our initial Mass, but also helps us in writing and documenting what we're doing here. Cardinal Wuerl today, very appreciative of him, and of course Cardinal Turkson. So we had great liturgies, great networking, and apostolic formation, so all three pillars of the Napa Institute. God bless all of you, and it's been nice to get to know each of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Stay with us. Well, before he can escape the stage, I just want to obviously thank the inspiration of the Napa Institute and talk about risk capital. He's put a lot of risk capital into this venture and probably lost a good chunk of it, but initially. But the model is working better and better with each passing day. But I want to thank Tim and Bush and his wife's staff, who really have made such a difference to make this happen and put together. He knows everybody. And so I don't know how he does it, but he's bringing together these prelates. He's bringing together, John Garvey and Andreas Widmer and Andrew Abella and all the various CUA leaders. And he knows, half the participants. He invites people personally. He's got these individuals just calling people, and making things happen. And he's just the shaker, the mover, the investor who really is the good prophet entrepreneur who's made the Napa Institute possible. So thank you very, very much, Tim, for everything you've really done.
Great job.
And I just can't forget Andreas Widmer. Because boy, oh boy, talk about another shaker and a mover, that without whom we wouldn't have so many of these. Weren't these speakers just over the top good? And thank you, Andreas, for really making it all happen and being such a great interviewer of Charles Koch. So what a terrific conference. Want to thank all of you who participated in it, especially in our faithful remnant who's shown up and stayed for the last talk. Thanks, everybody. God bless you, and have safe travels. Quick benediction in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the inspiration, the spirit, the freedom, the mastery, the discipline provided by all these speakers who have really tried to bring into focus what you intended through free enterprise and good profit. We ask you to continue to bless all of our efforts now as we go back into our own enterprises, educational institutions, so that we might be not only better practitioners, but better networkers to bring our collective will and our collective spirit to do the good to many, many others. We ask all of these things through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And may the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he look upon you with kindness and grant you peace. May Almighty God bless you all, Father and Son and Holy Spirit. Amen. Safe travels, everyone.